It was supposed to be a weekend to disconnect, to unplug from the daily grind and immerse myself in the quiet beauty of nature. I'd spent the past few weeks planning every detail of this camping trip. The weather forecast promised clear skies and cool nights, perfect for sleeping under the stars. I packed light, a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, and the essentials: a flashlight, a first aid kit, a map, and a compass.
No GPS.
This was my way of forcing myself to rely on my instincts and a good old-fashioned sense of direction. The trail I chose wasn't particularly remote, but it wasn't crowded either. A good middle ground, the kind of place where you might pass the occasional hiker but still feel like you're out there alone. It was a loop trail, roughly 10 miles, with a few side paths leading to scenic overlooks. I figured I'd set up camp about halfway, near a small creek marked on the map. From there, I'd explore some of the side trails, take photos, and enjoy the peace and quiet. I started out late Friday morning, the sun already high but the air still cool. The trailhead parking lot was nearly empty, just one other car parked near the entrance. I took note of it but didn't dwell on it. I hoisted my backpack, locked the car, and started walking. The trail was well marked, cutting through dense woods that smelled of pine and earth. Birds called to each other in the canopy above, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush hinted at squirrels or other small animals. It was exactly what I'd been craving. By mid-afternoon, I'd covered about 5 miles and found the creek. It wasn't much, just a narrow ribbon of water trickling over rocks, but it was enough for me. The ground nearby was flat and soft with pine needles, perfect for pitching a tent. I set up camp quickly, taking care to secure the stakes and organize my gear. Once everything was in place, I sat by the creek, eating a sandwich and letting the sound of running water wash over me. The first night was uneventful. The stars were incredible, scattered across the sky like glitter. I stayed up later than I should have, staring at them until my eyes grew heavy. The sounds of the forest at night were both comforting and unnerving. The chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I slept deeply, waking only once when a branch snapped somewhere nearby. It startled me, but after a few moments of silence, I convinced myself it was just a deer or some other harmless animal and drifted back to sleep. The next day, I explored one of the side trails. It led to a rocky outcrop with a breathtaking view of the valley below. I spent hours there, taking photos and just soaking it all in. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was sinking low, casting long shadows through the trees. I cooked a quick dinner and settled in for another quiet night. But that night wasn't quiet. It started with faint sounds in the distance, so subtle I wasn't sure if I was imagining them. A low, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps, but heavier. I sat up in my tent, straining to hear. The sound stopped. I told myself it was nothing. An animal, maybe the wind knocking a branch against a tree, and tried to go back to sleep. But an hour later, it started again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees around my campsite. Nothing moved. I listened, heart pounding, but the sound had stopped again. Swallowing my unease, I zipped the tent back up and lay down, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. I didn't sleep much after that. By morning, the sounds felt like a bad dream. In the daylight, the forest seemed so benign, so welcoming, that I almost laughed at myself. Still, I couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the car. There was no harm in being cautious, I told myself. Better safe than sorry. I packed up quickly and started back down the trail. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light on the path. I walked faster than I normally would, eager to put some distance between myself and the campsite. But as I neared the halfway point, I noticed something odd. The forest was too quiet. No birds, No rustling leaves, just the sound of my own footsteps. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. Then I saw it, a pile of rocks in the middle of the trail, neatly stacked like a cairn. But this wasn't a trail marker. It wasn't there when I passed this way yesterday. I stopped, staring at it, trying to make sense of it. My first thought was that someone else must have been on the trail. But why stack rocks here, in the middle of nowhere? I walked around the pile, giving it a wide berth, and kept moving. My pace quickened. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, but the trail behind me was always empty. About a mile from the trailhead, I found something else. A piece of fabric snagged on a branch, flapping gently in the breeze. It was bright red, standing out starkly against the green and brown of the forest. I picked it up, examining it. It looked like it had been torn from a jacket. That's when I heard it, a sound that froze me in place. Heavy breathing somewhere off to my right. Not an animal, human. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, but I couldn't see anyone. "Hello," I called, my voice shaky. No response, just the breathing getting louder, closer. I dropped the fabric and bolted. My pack thudded against my back as I ran, feet pounding the trail. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot. My car was still there, the only one. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, and finally managed to unlock the door. I threw my pack into the back seat and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the trailhead, half expecting someone to come charging out of the woods. But no one did. I started the car and drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds. The sense of relief didn't come until I was miles down the road, the forest far behind me. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about the trip. The sounds, the stacked rocks, the torn fabric, the breathing. I went online, searching for reports of anything unusual in that area, but found nothing. No missing persons, no strange sightings, nothing to explain what I'd experienced. To this day, I don't know what happened out there. Maybe it was just my imagination, fueled by isolation and the eerie quiet of the woods. Or maybe someone really was out there watching me. Either way, I haven't been camping alone since. I woke up to the sound of my alarm blaring in the early hours of the morning. The plan was to hit the road before sunrise, and I didn't want to waste a second. The camping trip was something I'd been looking forward to for weeks. A few days away from the grind, surrounded by nothing but trees, a cool breeze, and the quiet hum of nature. I packed my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, camp stove, food, water, and a first aid kit. Everything was checked twice. I liked being prepared. The drive to the national park took about 4 hours. By the time I arrived, the sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows through the dense forest. The parking lot at the trailhead was nearly empty, which was exactly how I wanted it. I wasn't here for a social outing. I was here for the solitude. I strapped my pack on, double-checked my map, and set off down the trail. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The crunch of my boots on the gravel path was the only sound for miles. The trail twisted and turned, climbing steadily into the mountains. The higher I got, the more the view opened up. Trees stretched out in every direction, their tops swaying gently in the wind. Birds flitted between the branches, their songs echoing through the woods. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that's hard to come by in the city. After about 5 hours of hiking, I reached the spot I'd marked on my map. It was a small clearing nestled between towering pines, with a creek running along one side. The ground was flat and covered in soft moss, perfect for setting up camp. I dropped my pack and stretched, feeling the ache in my shoulders and legs. The first thing I did was pitch my tent. It took a bit longer than I expected. The ground was softer than I'd anticipated, and getting the stakes to hold was a challenge. But eventually, I got it secured. With the tent up and my gear organized, I turned my attention to firewood. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, and I didn't want to be fumbling around in the dark. I found plenty of dry branches and twigs scattered around the clearing and piled them near the fire pit I'd made using rocks from the creek bed. Starting the fire was harder than I thought it would be. The matches I brought weren't striking right, and the wind kept blowing out the tiny flames. Frustration started to creep in, but I reminded myself to stay calm. Eventually, with the help of some dry leaves and a bit of patience, the fire caught. Dinner was simple: a can of beans and some bread I'd brought along. It wasn't gourmet by any means, but after a long day of hiking, it tasted incredible. I sat by the fire, eating slowly and watching the flames dance. The forest around me was quiet now, the birds having settled down for the night. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. As the sun disappeared completely, the temperature dropped sharply. I wrapped myself in a jacket and stared up at the stars. Out here, away from the city lights, the sky was incredible. Thousands of stars twinkled overhead, the Milky Way stretching across like a river of light. I felt small, but in a good way, like I was a tiny part of something much bigger. When the fire started to die down, I decided it was time to turn in. I doused the flames with water from the creek, making sure every ember was out before crawling into my tent. The sleeping bag was warm, and the soft sound of the creek was soothing. It didn't take long for me to fall asleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. The tent was pitch black, and the only sound was the faint trickle of the creek. But something felt off. My body was tense, my senses on high alert. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it. A faint crunch of leaves, like someone stepping lightly through the woods. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably just an animal. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. But the sound wasn't random. It was deliberate, methodical, like footsteps. They were slow and steady, moving closer to the tent. I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling. When I clicked it on, the beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the thin fabric of the tent. The sound stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear. Nothing, just the creak and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, flashlight in hand, jumping at every little noise. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy and uneasy. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before, peaceful and untouched. But when I stepped outside the tent, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints in the dirt, just a few feet from the tent. They weren't mine. These were fresh, the edges still sharp. They led from the edge of the clearing, circled around the tent, and disappeared back into the woods. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. They were too big to be an animal's and too deliberate in their pattern. Someone had been here. I felt a chill run down my spine. I come out here to get away from people, to be alone. The thought that someone had been wandering around my camp while I slept was unsettling, to say the least. I decided to pack up and move to a different spot. Maybe it was paranoia, but I didn't want to take any chances. I hiked for most of the day, putting as much distance as I could between me and the clearing. I found another campsite near a rocky outcrop with a great view of the valley below. It felt more open, less enclosed by trees, which made me feel a bit safer. That night, I built another fire and tried to relax. I told myself the footprints could have been from another hiker who stumbled upon my camp by accident. Maybe they didn't want to disturb me and left quietly. It was a reasonable explanation, but it didn't make me feel much better. The second night was worse. I woke up again to the sound of footsteps, but this time, they were closer. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I grabbed the flashlight and my knife, the only weapon I had. The footsteps stopped as soon as I moved, but this time, I was sure they'd been real. I waited, straining to hear, but the forest was silent. In the morning, I found more footprints. They were closer to the tent this time, and there were more of them. Whoever it was had been circling my camp again, and they'd stayed for a while. Panic started to set in. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I decided to cut the trip short and head back to the trailhead. The idea of spending another night out here was unbearable. The hike back was grueling. I pushed myself hard, barely stopping to rest. Every sound in the forest made me jump, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sending my heart racing. By the time I reached the parking lot, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. My car was still there, untouched. I threw my pack in the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. As I pulled out onto the road, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I'd made it out. But the thing is, I still don't know who or what was out there. Maybe it was just another hiker, curious or lost. Maybe it was someone looking for trouble. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something I can't explain. All I know is that I've never felt fear like I did those 2 nights in the woods. It's the kind of fear that stays with you, that creeps into the back of your mind every time you're alone in the dark. I haven't been camping since. I always thought camping alone in the woods would be peaceful, a chance to get away from everything, clear my head, and reconnect with nature. No distractions, no stress, just me and the wild. I'd done group trips before and felt confident about handling things on my own. I packed my gear meticulously. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, and all the essentials like a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a knife. I chose a remote spot, far from the usual campsites, deep into the forest where I could be completely alone. The first day started off well. I parked my car at a trailhead and hiked about 6 miles to a secluded area by a small, crystal-clear lake. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. Felt like exactly what I needed. After setting up my tent and organizing my gear, I spent the afternoon fishing at the lake. The serenity was overwhelming, the kind of quiet that makes you feel small but content. As the sun began to set, I made a small fire and cooked the fish I'd caught. The smoky flavor, combined with the satisfaction of catching my own meal, was incredible. The stars came out in full force, brighter than I'd ever seen them back in the city. I sat by the fire, staring at the sky, until the chill in the air forced me into my sleeping bag. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a strange sound. It was faint at first, a rhythmic crunching like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was probably just an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon. I lay still, listening, trying to pinpoint the direction. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions, but it never got too close. After what felt like an eternity, it stopped. I stayed awake for another hour, clutching my knife, before exhaustion took over, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I convinced myself I'd overreacted. The forest is full of noises, and my imagination had probably amplified them. I decided to explore the area, leaving markers so I wouldn't lose my way. The forest was dense, with towering trees and thick undergrowth, but I found a few game trails that made walking easier. I came across animal tracks, deer, rabbits, and something larger, maybe a bear. That made me a bit uneasy, but I reminded myself I had bear spray and knew how to use it. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was dipping low. I gathered more firewood, prepared a simple meal, and settled in for another night. As the fire crackled and the darkness enveloped the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. That night, I woke up again. This time, the sound was closer and unmistakably human. It was the sound of someone walking, deliberate, slow steps crunching on the dry forest floor. My heart pounded as I strained to hear. The steps would stop for a while, and then start again, moving around the perimeter of my camp. I reached for my flashlight and knife, my hands shaking. When I finally mustered the courage to unzip the tent and shine the light outside, there was nothing. The forest was still, except for the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, I decided to pack up and leave. Maybe I was overreacting, but the unease was too much. As I dismantled my tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Around the campsite, in the dirt and scattered leaves, were footprints. They were human, barefoot, and larger than mine. They circled the camp and then disappeared into the woods. The hike back to the car was nerve-wracking. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, relief washed over me. I loaded my gear as quickly as possible and got in, locking the doors. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints. Who would be out there, barefoot, in the middle of nowhere? I told myself it could have been another camper, but deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. I hadn't seen a single person the entire time, and the spot I'd chosen wasn't on any official map. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had been watching me, circling my camp, in the middle of the night. I haven't been camping since. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend in the woods, just me, my backpack, and the trees. I've always enjoyed solo camping trips. There's something about the solitude, the crackle of the fire, and the absence of distractions that makes me feel alive. But this trip was different. It left a mark on me in ways I never expected. I picked a spot in a national forest a few hours from home, a place I had researched online. It was known for its rugged terrain, scenic trails, and lack of cell service. Perfect. I wanted to disconnect completely for a couple of days. My plan was simple: hike to a secluded spot by the river, set up camp, and spend 2 nights under the stars. I arrived early Friday morning, parked my car at the trailhead, and double-checked my gear. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, first aid kit. Everything was accounted for. The trail was about 6 miles to the spot I had in mind, a clearing near the river that was supposedly less trafficked than other areas. The air was crisp, the kind of fresh that fills your lungs and makes you feel awake. The trail started off wide and well-marked, winding through towering pines and patches of ferns. I felt a sense of peace as I walked, the weight of my pack a comforting presence on my back. About 2 miles in, the trail narrowed, and the trees grew denser. I noticed fewer signs of other hikers, no footprints, no discarded wrappers, nothing. It was exactly what I was looking for. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional chirp of a bird. Every now and then, I'd hear the distant rush of the river, growing louder as I got closer. I reached the clearing by mid-afternoon. It was perfect. The ground was flat, and the river was about 50 yards away, its water clear and fast-moving. There were no signs of anyone having camped there recently. I set down my pack and began to set up my tent. The process was methodical, almost meditative. Once the tent was up, I gathered some firewood from the surrounding area, careful to only pick up dry, fallen branches. By the time I got the fire going, the sun was starting to dip below the treetops, casting long shadows across the clearing. Dinner was simple: a freeze-dried meal rehydrated with boiling water. As I ate, I watched the fire dance and listened to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful, the kind of peace you only find far away from the hum of civilization. When the stars came out, I felt a sense of awe. The sky was so clear that I could see the Milky Way stretching across the darkness. It was mesmerizing. I crawled into my tent around 10 p.m., tired from the hike and the fresh air. The rhythmic sound of the river was soothing, like nature's lullaby. I fell asleep quickly. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The forest was silent except for the river. I lay still, listening, trying to pinpoint what had disturbed my sleep. That's when I heard it. A faint rustling, like leaves being disturbed. It was subtle, almost too quiet to notice, but it was there. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. Animals are active at night, and I was in their territory. Still, I felt uneasy. The sound continued, sporadic and soft. I reached for my flashlight, turned it on, and pointed it toward the tent wall. Nothing. I unzipped the tent and shone the light outside. The clearing was empty. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting faint light on the surrounding area. I didn't see anything unusual. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing and went back inside. The next morning, I felt a little foolish for being so on edge. The sun was shining, the forest was alive with birdsong, and everything seemed normal. I made coffee and oatmeal, packed a small bag, and decided to spend the day exploring the area. There were no marked trails near my campsite, so I followed the river upstream, keeping it in sight as I walked. The terrain was rough, with uneven ground and dense underbrush, but I enjoyed the challenge. I found a small waterfall about a mile from camp and spent some time there, enjoying the sound of the water and the solitude. By the time I returned to camp, it was late afternoon. The clearing looked just as I had left it, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air seemed heavier, the silence deeper. I tried to shake off the feeling as I gathered more firewood and prepared dinner. As the sun set, the unease grew. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees for no reason. The forest felt different, as if it were watching me. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. I kept telling myself it was just the forest being the forest, but the logic didn't help. My body was tense, my mind racing. Sometime after midnight, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of heavy footsteps. Not the light, sporadic steps of an animal, but deliberate, measured steps. Human steps. My heart pounded as I lay there, frozen. The footsteps were coming from the direction of the river, moving toward my tent. They stopped just outside. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Then, the footsteps started again, circling the tent slowly. I've never felt fear like that before, a primal kind of fear that made every muscle in my body scream at me to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe properly. The footsteps stopped again, and for a long time, there was nothing but silence. I don't know how long I lay there, waiting, listening. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up, it was dawn. The first thing I did was check around the campsite. There were no signs of anyone. No footprints, no disturbed ground, nothing. It didn't make sense. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it, that my mind had played tricks on me in the dark. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I decided to cut the trip short. I packed up my gear quickly, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest, which had felt so welcoming on the first day, now felt oppressive. The hike back to the trailhead was nerve-wracking. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made my heart race. I felt like I was being watched, but every time I stopped to look around, I saw nothing. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly brought me to tears. I threw my pack in the back, got in, and locked the doors. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was a person, maybe it wasn't. All I know is that something was out there, and it was aware of me. I haven't been camping alone since, and I'm not sure I ever will again. The cold night air nipped at my face as I sat by the fire, staring into the flickering orange flames. The forest surrounded me on all sides, tall pines swaying gently in the breeze. It was quiet except for the occasional crackle of the fire and the rustle of leaves in the dark. This was exactly what I had been craving. A weekend of solitude and simplicity, away from the noise of the city and the endless notifications on my phone. I'd set up camp in a clearing about 5 miles off the main trail, deep enough into the woods that I wouldn't encounter many hikers, if any. My tent was pitched just a few feet from the fire, my sleeping bag already laid out inside. My gear was minimal: a small propane stove, a couple of cans of chili, a flashlight, a knife, and the essentials for starting a fire. It was late October, and while the days were still manageable, the nights dipped into freezing temperatures. I was prepared, though, or at least I thought I was. After finishing a quick dinner of instant noodles and jerky, I leaned back against a log and looked up at the stars. They were impossibly bright, scattered like shards of glass across the sky. It's amazing how much the city dulls them, I thought. Out here, they felt alive, almost close enough to touch. I took a deep breath of the crisp air, letting it fill my lungs. This was peace. But peace doesn't last forever. It rarely does. The first sign that something wasn't right came as a sound. It was faint at first, barely perceptible over the crackling of the fire, a distant snapping of twigs. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. The woods are full of sounds like that, especially at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was closer than it should be. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the fire. I added another log, watching as the flames licked at the dry wood. But the sound came again, louder this time. A deliberate crunch of leaves, the kind of sound that only comes from something heavy pressing down. I sat up straighter, my heart beginning to thud in my chest. I scanned the darkness beyond the firelight. My flashlight was within reach, but I hesitated to grab it. Part of me didn't want to know what was out there. The fire cast long shadows on the trees, and every movement of the branches seemed to morph into something alive. I told myself to relax. It's just your imagination, I thought. You're alone out here. No one knows you're here. That last thought didn't bring as much comfort as I hoped. I forced myself to lie down, pulling my sleeping bag up to my chin. The fire would keep any animals away, I reasoned. I'd be fine. The forest was just doing what forests do, making noise, playing tricks on the mind. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I woke up. The fire had died down to embers, casting only a faint glow. My breath was visible in the frigid air, each exhale a small cloud that hung above me before dissipating. For a moment, I lay there, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep, and then I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. This time, there was no mistaking it. The sound was steady, moving through the trees just beyond the clearing. My pulse quickened, my ears straining to pick up every detail. It wasn't an animal. The steps were too heavy, too rhythmic. Someone was out there. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly. My other hand instinctively went to the knife strapped to my belt. Sitting up slowly, I clicked on the flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating tree trunks and underbrush. But there was nothing. No movement, no figure, nothing to explain the noise. "Hello," I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded small, weak, swallowed up by the vastness of the forest. The footsteps stopped. Silence enveloped the clearing, so complete it felt oppressive. Even the wind had died down, the trees standing still as sentinels. I held my breath, listening. A minute passed, then another. Slowly, I lowered the flashlight, telling myself it was just some stray hiker passing through. Maybe they'd gotten lost and didn't want to startle me. That made sense, didn't it? Still clutching the flashlight and knife, I crawled back into the tent and zipped it up. I knew it wouldn't stop anyone or anything, but it felt like some semblance of protection. I sat there for what felt like hours, every nerve in my body on edge. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. When I woke up, the sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The fire was completely out, and the air was bitterly cold. I stepped out of the tent, stretching my stiff limbs. In the light of day, the fear from the night before seemed almost silly. Almost. I decided to do a quick sweep of the area, just to reassure myself. With the flashlight in hand, I circled the clearing, looking for any signs of disturbance. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, pressed into the soft dirt near the edge of the clearing. They weren't mine, the tread was different, and they were larger than my boots. My stomach twisted as I followed them, tracing their path. They came from the trees, circled the clearing, and then stopped, right by my tent. A cold dread settled over me. Someone had been here, watching me while I slept. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. I looked around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the trees, but the forest was empty, or at least it seemed that way. I decided then and there that my trip was over. The whole reason I'd come out here was to find peace, and now the woods felt anything but peaceful. I packed up my gear in record time, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The hike back to the trailhead was the longest 5 miles of my life. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I kept my knife in hand, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement, but I didn't see anyone. By the time I reached my car, my legs were trembling, both from exertion and fear. I threw my pack into the back seat and got in, locking the doors as soon as I was inside. My hands shook as I started the engine, the sound of it roaring to life a small comfort. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that whoever had been out there was still watching me. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the main road, that I began to relax. The tension in my shoulders eased, and my breathing slowed. I told myself I was safe now, that it was over. But even now, sitting here writing this, I can't help but glance over my shoulder. The memory of those footprints, of the footsteps in the dark, lingers in my mind. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I'm not sure I want to. All I know is that I'll think twice before camping alone again. The weekend was supposed to be an escape. Just me, the wilderness, and the soothing quiet that only comes from being miles away from civilization. I had picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any marked trail. It was a place I'd seen on a map and decided it was perfect for a weekend alone. The idea was to disconnect, no phone, no people, no distractions. I wanted to clear my head, breathe fresh air, and sleep under the stars. Friday afternoon, I parked my car at the edge of a dirt road that seemed seldom used. I double-checked my gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, knife, flashlight, matches, and a small first aid kit. I had everything I needed for 2 nights. Slinging the heavy pack over my shoulders, I headed into the trees, following a faint deer path I had spotted. The forest quickly swallowed me up, the car and the road vanishing behind layers of dense green. The hike was tough but manageable. The trail was uneven, with exposed roots and occasional rocky patches. Every so often, I would stop to catch my breath, the weight of my pack pressing into my shoulders. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows that danced with the wind. Felt good to be out here, away from the buzz of life. The air was cool, the only sounds the crunch of leaves under my boots and the distant calls of birds. After a few hours, I reached a small clearing by a creek. The spot was perfect. Flat ground for the tent, water nearby, and surrounded by thick woods for privacy. Setting up camp was a satisfying routine. I pitched the tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and started a small fire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I cooked a simple meal over the flames and sat back to enjoy the quiet. The stars slowly appeared, one by one, until the sky was a sprawling map of constellations. I stayed up for a while, staring into the fire and listening to the sounds of the forest. The rustle of leaves, the chirp of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl. The first night was uneventful. I slept deeply, waking only once to the sound of something moving outside the tent, probably a raccoon or a deer. The thought barely registered before I drifted back to sleep. Saturday morning, I decided to explore the area. After breakfast, I followed the creek downstream, weaving through the forest and occasionally stopping to take in the scenery. The woods were alive with small movements, squirrels darting up trees, birds flitting between branches, insects buzzing near the water. The creek's gentle burble was a constant backdrop, soothing and rhythmic. A couple of hours later, I found a small waterfall. It wasn't tall, maybe 6 or 7 feet, but the water cascaded over mossy rocks into a crystal clear pool below. I sat there for a while, soaking in the peacefulness, before heading back to camp. The hike back was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. Every so often, I thought I heard faint rustling behind me. I'd stop, listening intently, but the woods would go still, probably just animals. Still, the feeling lingered. By the time I reached camp, the sun was starting to dip. I built up the fire again, cooked dinner, and tried to relax. But the unease from earlier hadn't left me. The forest seemed quieter than before. The usual sounds of birds and insects were muted, almost absent. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. As night fell, the fire's glow felt like a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. I stayed up later than the night before, reluctant to crawl into the tent. When I finally did, I left the flashlight within easy reach. Lying there, I listened to the night, every rustle and creak amplified in the stillness. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, but it was a restless kind of sleep, broken by strange dreams and the vague sense of something not quite right. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke abruptly. My heart was racing, though I wasn't sure why. I lay there, straining to hear past the pounding in my chest. That's when I heard it. A faint crunch of leaves, deliberate and slow. It wasn't the random scurry of an animal. It was heavier, more measured. My first thought was a bear, but it didn't sound quite right. I reached for the knife I'd left by my sleeping bag, my fingers closing around the handle. The sound moved closer, circling the tent. My breath caught in my throat as I listened. Whoever or whatever it was stopped just outside. I could hear the faintest hint of breathing. My mind raced. Should I make noise? Try to scare it off? Or stay silent and hope it went away? Before I could decide, the person I realized with a jolt moved again, their footsteps retreating into the woods. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, every muscle tense, knife gripped tightly in my hand. Eventually, the forest settled back into its usual quiet, but I didn't sleep again that night. When dawn finally came, I unzipped the tent cautiously, scanning the clearing. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to pack up and head back to the car. The trip wasn't worth staying another night. As I dismantled the tent, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. They were larger, and the tread didn't match my boots. The tracks circled the tent and then disappeared into the woods. My stomach churned. The hike back to the car was nerve-wracking. Every sound made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the woods remained empty, at least as far as I could tell. When I finally reached the car, I threw my pack into the back seat and climbed in, locking the doors immediately. As I drove away, I felt the tension slowly ease, but the sense of unease lingered. Who had been out there miles from any trail or road? And why had they come so close to my tent? I still think about that weekend sometimes, especially when I'm out in the woods. I've gone camping since, but never alone. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also vast and indifferent, hiding secrets in its shadows. Whatever or whoever was out there that night, I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. It started as a simple weekend trip. I'd always loved the outdoors, and there was something about camping that let me reset. Just me, a tent, and miles of untouched wilderness. I had taken some time off work, needing a break from the endless grind. A friend had mentioned a remote campsite near the national forest, a place that was supposedly untouched by the crowds that normally swarmed the more popular spots. That's what I wanted. Quiet, isolation, peace. The drive out was long and winding, the kind where the roads get narrower the further you go, until you're navigating unpaved paths littered with potholes. My car's suspension groaned in protest, but I pressed on, determined to make it to the spot my friend had recommended. The directions were straightforward. Follow the dirt road for 10 miles, park by the clearing, and hike another 3 miles to the site. It sounded perfect. When I arrived at the clearing, it was already mid-afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I grabbed my pack, double-checked my supplies, and locked the car. I had everything I needed: food, water, a first aid kit, a map, and a GPS device for good measure. The trail was faint but visible, winding its way through dense trees. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of pine and moss. The hike in was uneventful, though the forest felt eerily quiet. No birds chirping, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just the crunch of my boots on the trail and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I chalked it up to being deeper in the woods than usual. Wildlife tends to avoid humans, and this place was as remote as it got. When I reached the campsite, I couldn't help but smile. It was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by towering trees, with a gentle slope leading down to a crystal-clear stream. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, facing the stream. The sound of the water was soothing, a constant murmur that blended into the background. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal. The flames danced in the growing darkness, casting flickering shadows on the trees around me. I leaned back against a log, sipping on a cup of instant coffee, feeling the tension of the past weeks melt away. The stars began to appear, first a few, then a blanket of them, brighter than I'd ever seen in the city. It was moments like this that reminded me why I loved being out here. By the time I crawled into my tent, the forest was pitch black. I zipped up the flap, slid into my sleeping bag, and let the rhythmic sound of the stream lull me to sleep. I woke up suddenly, disoriented. My heart was pounding, though I wasn't sure why. took a moment to remember where I was. The tent was dark, and the forest outside was silent. Too silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. My instincts told me something was off. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam illuminated the inside of the tent, revealing nothing unusual. I listened for any sounds, holding my breath. Then I heard it, a faint crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. It was distant, but unmistakable. My grip tightened on the flashlight as I strained to hear more. Another crunch, closer this time. My mind raced. Could be an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe a raccoon. But the steps were deliberate, too heavy for a small animal. I felt a chill run down my spine. I debated whether to unzip the tent and look outside. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to stay hidden and hope whatever it was would move on. But another part, the part that valued preparation and caution, urged me to investigate. I grabbed the hunting knife I'd packed and slowly unzipped the tent, just enough to peer out. The forest was still, bathed in the pale light of the moon. Shadows stretched across the ground, but I couldn't see anything unusual. I stepped out cautiously, my flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other. The air was cold against my skin, and every step I took seemed deafeningly loud. I circled the campsite, scanning the area with my flashlight. Nothing. No signs of movement, no glowing eyes reflecting the light. Just the trees, the stream, and the endless darkness. I told myself I was being paranoid and headed back to the tent, though my nerves were still on edge. The rest of the night passed without incident, though I slept lightly, waking at every little sound. When dawn finally broke, I felt a wave of relief. The morning light chased away the unease of the night, and I convinced myself it had been my imagination. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, filled with vibrant greens and the sound of birds chirping. I followed the stream for a while, enjoying the solitude. As I walked, I kept an eye out for tracks or signs of wildlife, curious about what might have been near my campsite the night before. About a mile downstream, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. There, in the soft mud by the edge of the stream, was a footprint. Human, barefoot. It was large, larger than my own, and the toes were splayed wide as if whoever made it had been walking naturally without shoes. A shiver ran through me. I scanned the area, suddenly hyper-aware of my surroundings. The forest seemed different now, less inviting. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I considered turning back to the campsite, but decided to press on a little further. I needed to know if there was more to this. As I continued, I found more footprints, all leading deeper into the woods. They were sporadic, sometimes overlapping, as if whoever left them had been wandering aimlessly. The prints seemed fresh, not more than a day old. My stomach tightened. By midday, I was back at my campsite, feeling uneasy. I couldn't shake the image of those footprints. Who else would be out here, miles from the nearest road, walking barefoot? It didn't make sense. I decided to cut my trip short and leave the next morning. That night, I built a larger fire, its light casting a wide circle around my camp. I kept my knife close and stayed alert, listening for any unusual sounds. The forest was quiet, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the calm before a storm. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and too close for comfort. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and knife. I scanned the darkness beyond the firelight, but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, waiting for dawn. When the first light of morning broke through the trees, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. The hike back to my car was nerve-wracking. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. When I finally reached the clearing where my car was parked, I felt a wave of relief. I tossed my pack into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, a figure partially hidden among the trees watching me. It was too far away to make out any details, but I knew it wasn't an animal. I didn't wait to find out more. I put the car in gear and sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I was miles away. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I got home, I told myself I'd been paranoid, that the footprints and noises could be explained away. But deep down, I knew better. Someone had been out there watching me, and whoever they were, they hadn't wanted me to know they were there. I woke up early that morning with a sense of excitement buzzing through me. It was going to be my first solo camping trip. I had planned it for weeks, pored over maps, researched the best trails, checked the weather forecast a dozen times. Everything was set. I wanted the experience of being alone with nature, away from the constant hum of people and their never-ending noise. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, and the further I got from the city, the calmer I felt. The air smelled fresher, cleaner. I parked my car in the small gravel lot, shouldered my pack, and set off. The trail was well maintained, winding gently upward through tall pine trees. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the path. My boots crunched against the dirt, and the rhythmic sound was almost meditative. I'd chosen this area because it was remote but not entirely deserted. The ranger had mentioned it wasn't a heavily trafficked trail, but there were usually a few other hikers or campers around. Still, as I hiked deeper into the forest, I didn't see a single soul. First, it was peaceful. The quiet felt like a blanket wrapping around me, soothing and soft. But as the day went on, the isolation started to settle in. The silence was heavy, almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant chirp of a bird. After about 6 hours of hiking, I found the perfect spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing surrounded by dense trees, with a view of the valley below. The spot felt secluded, like my own little piece of the world. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and got a small fire going. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was exhausted but content. I ate a quick meal of dehydrated soup and sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. The woods around me were dark now, the kind of darkness that only exists far from civilization. The stars above were brilliant, more numerous than I'd ever seen. It felt good to be out here, disconnected from everything. I thought about how rare it was to experience this kind of stillness. But then I heard it, a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a low rustling in the trees. But it wasn't. It was too deliberate, too steady. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable. My heart jumped, and I froze, straining to listen. They stopped as suddenly as they started. I told myself it could have been an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. The rhythm of those steps had sounded human. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. I'd read about first-night jitters during solo camping trips. It was common, apparently. Your brain isn't used to the sounds of the wild, and it plays tricks on you. I doused the fire, climbed into my tent, and zipped it up tight. I lay there, listening, every nerve in my body on edge. But the sound didn't come back. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, everything seemed fine. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and the forest looked a lot less menacing in the daylight. I laughed at myself for being so spooked the night before. I made some instant coffee, packed up my gear, and continued hiking deeper into the woods. By midday, I found another great spot to camp, near a small, bubbling creek. The sound of the water was soothing, and I spent the afternoon exploring the area, taking photos and jotting notes in my journal. But as the sun began to set, the uneasy feeling from the night before crept back in. The woods felt off. It was hard to explain. The stillness that had been comforting earlier now felt unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, though I couldn't say why. I ate a cold dinner and climbed into my tent early, hoping to sleep off the unease. But sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound outside felt magnified. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. And then, just like the night before, I heard the footsteps. This time they were closer, slow, deliberate, circling my campsite. My mouth went dry, and my pulse thundered in my ears. I clutched the small camping knife I'd brought with me, my only weapon. The footsteps stopped again, and the silence that followed was deafening. I lay there, every muscle in my body tense, waiting, but nothing happened. Eventually, the exhaustion overtook my fear once more, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. When I woke up, it was early morning, the first light of dawn filtering through the trees. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, half expecting to find something. But there was nothing. No footprints, no signs of disturbance. It was like nothing had happened, but I knew what I'd heard. I wasn't imagining it. I decided to cut my trip short. The whole point of this adventure was to enjoy myself, to find peace and solitude. But all I'd found was anxiety and unease. I packed up my gear quickly, my eyes constantly scanning the woods around me. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and every rustle of leaves made my heart leap. About halfway back, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a small, makeshift shelter hidden just off the trail. It wasn't much, a lean-to made of branches and a tattered tarp. But what caught my attention was what was inside. A pile of empty food wrappers, a rusty knife, and a single mud-caked boot. My stomach turned. This wasn't some old, abandoned campsite. Someone had been here recently. Maybe they were still here. I didn't stick around to find out. I picked up my pace, practically jogging down the trail. The sense of being watched grew stronger, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. I forced myself not to look back, afraid of what I might see. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, relief washed over me like a wave. I'd never been so happy to see that beat-up old vehicle. I threw my pack in the back seat, jumped in, and locked the doors. As I started the engine and pulled out of the lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw movement among the trees. A shadow, a figure. But when I looked again, it was gone. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the city, surrounded by people and noise and light. That night, safe in my apartment, I replayed everything in my mind. The footsteps, the shelter, the overwhelming sense of being watched. I don't know who or what was out there, but I'm sure of one thing. I wasn't alone. And as much as I love the idea of solitude, I don't think I'll be seeking it out again anytime soon. It was late October when I decided to head out on a solo camping trip. I had been itching to get away from the city and lose myself in the quiet of the woods. The air was crisp, and the leaves were a symphony of orange, red, and gold. I picked a remote spot, one that I had scouted online. It was a few miles off the main trail, secluded, perfect for solitude. I packed light but smart. A tent, a sleeping bag, enough food and water for 3 days, a map, a compass, and a small emergency kit. The hike to the campsite was uneventful. The sun filtered through the thinning canopy, casting long shadows on the ground. Occasionally, a breeze would stir the leaves, sending them skittering across the forest floor. I reached my chosen spot by mid-afternoon, a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and oaks. It was serene. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and set up camp. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I had a small fire crackling and a pot of instant noodles warming up. The first night was uneventful. I fell asleep to the sound of the wind whispering through the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. When I woke up the next morning, the forest was bathed in a pale golden light. I spent the day exploring the area, taking note of landmarks to ensure I wouldn't get lost. There was a stream not too far from my campsite, its water clear and cold. I refilled my water bottles there and sat for a while, listening to the gentle gurgle of the current. Everything felt peaceful. It was that evening when things started to feel off. As I was preparing my dinner, I noticed the forest had gone unnaturally quiet. The usual rustle of animals in the underbrush, the calls of birds, all of it had stopped. The only sound was the crackling of my fire. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe I just wasn't paying attention, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. My heart was pounding, but everything was still. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light around the clearing. I lay there listening. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was slow, deliberate. My first thought was that it might be a deer, but the steps were too heavy. It sounded like a person. I stayed completely still, my ears straining. The footsteps seemed to circle the campsite, moving closer, then farther away. I reached for the flashlight next to my sleeping bag, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away my exact position. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. I lay there for hours, too afraid to move, until exhaustion finally overtook me. The next morning, I found nothing unusual around the campsite. No footprints, no signs of anyone or anything. I convinced myself it must have been an animal, maybe a bear or a large raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. I decided to stay one more night and leave early the next morning. That day, I stuck close to the campsite, gathering more firewood and double-checking my gear. I kept my knife on me at all times, feeling a bit ridiculous but safer nonetheless. As the sun set, the forest fell into silence again. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the warmth of the fire and the simple task of eating dinner. But the tension in my chest wouldn't go away. That night, I woke up again. This time, it was to the sound of something brushing against my tent. It was soft, almost like a hand grazing the fabric. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. The sound came again, a faint scraping along the side of the tent. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I didn't hear footsteps or any movement, just the oppressive silence of the forest. When dawn finally broke, I stepped out of the tent, my knife still in hand. The clearing looked the same as it always had, but I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Around the tent, the leaves had been disturbed, forming a rough circle. It wasn't an animal. The pattern was too deliberate, too intentional. Someone had been there. I decided then and there to pack up and leave. I stuffed my gear into my backpack, doused the fire, and started back toward the main trail. My heart was pounding the entire time. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set me on edge. I felt like I was being watched, though I never saw anyone. About an hour into the hike, I came across something that made me stop in my tracks. A small pile of stones sat in the middle of the path. They hadn't been there when I first came through. The stones were stacked carefully, almost ritualistically. My stomach churned. I stepped around it and quickened my pace, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. As I neared the trailhead, I began to hear the faint sound of running water. Relief washed over me. The stream was a landmark. I was close to the end, but as I approached, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the bank of the stream, partially submerged in the water, was a single boot. It looked old and worn, but it was unmistakably human. I didn't stick around to investigate. I crossed the stream and practically ran the rest of the way back to my car. When I finally reached the parking lot, I was shaking. My car was the only one there. I tossed my gear into the back seat, jumped in, and locked the doors. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But the road behind me remained empty. It's been weeks since that trip, and I still can't explain what happened. I've replayed it over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just some prankster trying to scare me, or maybe it was something more sinister. All I know is that I've lost my desire for solo camping. The woods don't feel like a refuge anymore. They feel like a place where you can disappear without a trace.